Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, or afternoon, depending on what part of the country you're in. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar on stalking and the intersections with teen dating violence. My name is Jennifer Martinez, and I am here with the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. We are an OVW Rural TA grant provider, and we are partnering with SPARC, the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, to provide this webinar to you today. And I'm going to hand it over to the presenter from SPARC, Dana Flightman. She's an associate advisor with them and will be taking it from here. Thanks so much, Dana.
Great. Thank you to Daniel and Jennifer, and thank you all so much for taking the time to join me. I know it's an uncertain time, so a lot of us are at home, so thanks so much for making the time, and I hope you're all staying safe and healthy and sane. So today we'll be talking about stalking in relation to teen dating violence. And one thing I'm curious about, and Daniel, if you can, pull up this poll, how many of you have had the opportunity to attend a training specifically on the topic of stalking before? So it might have been mentioned in other trainings, but let me know if this is your first stalking training, maybe one or two, or oh boy, I've done so many, I could leave this. So don't worry, I won't make you, but I'll give you just a second to fill that out. Okay, so it looks like about half of folks are saying, "Oh, I've been to maybe one or two," but almost 40%, over 40% are saying, "Actually, this is my first one." So thanks so much for doing that. And that's really typical. I do these trainings all across the country for audiences ranging from campuses to law enforcement, victim advocates, educators, and typically half to sometimes even the whole room have never had the opportunity to attend a training specifically on the topic of stalking, even though they're seasoned professionals like yourselves who are doing great work in the field. And I think one of the reasons is that stalking is so often an afterthought in our field. We have four major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act. It's domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. It's always kind of and stalking. We almost call their website andstalking.org because it's something that's often relegated to an afterthought in our field. And the truth is, I know that you're already working with victims and survivors of stalking as it is, and that you're doing such essential work. And I hope by the end of today, you can move that and stalking a little bit to the beginning of the sentence and be seeing the essential work you're doing through that lens a little bit more. So thanks so much again for taking the time to do that. I'm from the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, which is a project of Equitas. We are fully funded by the Office of Violence Against Women. So our website, we did not go with andstalking.org. We went with stalkingawareness.org. There we have training modules. So if you do any kind of public awareness education on your campus or in your community, we have scripted slides there that you could just pick up and use, as well as discussion guides for the show you and some other resources and activity ideas. We have resources for victims. So while we're not a direct service provider, we know that victims do come to our website because there are so few standalone resources for victims of stalking. So we have brochures that you can order. Actually, I suggest you do so, that you could hand to victims of stalking, as well as some guidance there. We have practitioner guides, and we break those out by discipline. So for law enforcement, for awareness educators, for prosecutors, for victim advocates. And so we're always looking to grow our content there, and webinars like this one. So we record a lot of webinars. So if at the end of this one, you're like, man, I wish I could hear Dana talk even more, you might be in luck because my recorded voice and our director, Jan Landheis's recorded voice is all over our website if you're looking for something to do during your social distancing. We're also on social media. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Follow Us Legally. If you get our sixth sense of humor at SPARC, if not, it'll be a long hour and a half for you. So really your call either way. We have a newsletter as well. We try not to send it too often, try to practice what we preach and not send too many emails, right? But we do notify you if we have new resources, upcoming webinars, things like that. So I also suggest that you subscribe there to keep in touch with us. So why talk about stalking? Besides that, we're supposed to, and it's one of those four Violence Against Women Act crimes. Well, stalking is a really important thing to understand because it is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It is a crime in all 50 states and the District of Columbia and U.S. territories. It's a crime in the military justice system, on tribal lands, and at the federal level. It might be a misdemeanor, it might be a felony, it depends on your jurisdiction and the situation, but it is a crime. A lot of folks don't realize that stalking is a crime. And so you have victims saying, well, what am I going to do? Call the police because somebody rang my doorbell or sent me some text messages? And the answer should be yes, if it's part of a stalking crime. And so we definitely need to think about it as a crime, just as sexual assault and domestic violence are crimes. And it is traumatic. So a lot of times when we talk about how critical it is to recognize stalking, folks are tempted to go right to that intersection with physical violence and lethality. And that is really important. I'll get to it in just a couple of slides. I agree that's really critical. But I also want to pause here and note that even if the stalking in no way intersects with physical violence, sexual violence, or lethality, it's a crime in its own right because it's a deeply traumatic thing for victims and survivors to experience. Many stalking victims experience mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, insomnia, social dysfunction. Those can be lifelong and extremely severe. Many lose time from work. So 1 in 8 lose time from work. More than half lose 5 days of work or more. And stalking victims typically are not a protected class. And so if a stalking victim goes to their employer and says, hey, I need to switch shifts, or could I not answer the phones because of this stalking situation, the employer could be wonderful and accommodating, or the employer can say, that's an inconvenience, you're fired. And typically that's legal. And many relocate. And this really shocked me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move. So think about how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? You've decided to move, and still to pack yourself and your family up and find the movers and find the new place, and how stressful and expensive and exhausting that is. We have 1 in 7 stalking victims making that choice as a result of their victimization. So I think that really goes to how traumatic and consuming this crime really is. It's always great to hear from survivors in their own words. This is a stalking survivor saying, it's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there. And unfortunately, this is a very typical quote for stalking victims because stalkers can be quite persistent, and their intent is to create the impression that they're always everywhere, always watching. I've talked to so many stalking victims who say, you know, I knew the day that the offender got out of jail or probation ended, they'd call me, and they did. And so it can be lifelong and just keep going and create that feeling that you're never really alone and that it's never really over. And stalking is dangerous. It often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons to threaten or actually harm their victims. And in 76% of intimate partner femicides, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that homicide or attempted homicide. And yet so often those stalking signs get missed and we say, oh, it's just text messages, it's just following, no one's really getting hurt here. And it's really not true. In fact, one of the researchers we work with, who's really wonderful, went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. If you look at our intimate partner homicide cases, whether that's for teens or adults, for teens, I often see it called breakup violence, right? If you look back at those, you almost always see stalking and an escalation of stalking leading up to that event. And the point here isn't to play Monday morning quarterback, but it is to recognize that stalking is a serious indicator that there could be future violence. But what's really actually great about that is it gives us an opportunity, because stalking is one of the few crimes where early identification and intervention can prevent violence and even death, not to mention all the trauma that a stalking victim experiences, right? And so when we do recognize stalking for what it is and intervene early, we have an opportunity to make a huge difference, whether we're working with teens or adults. Yet it's very underreported. So similar to domestic violence or sexual violence, less than 40% of stalking victims report to law enforcement. And this is for a variety of reasons. Some, again, quite similar to those other crimes. They might feel embarrassed. They might feel it's a private matter. With stalking especially, I would argue, a lot of victims feel that they lack evidence, and they also tend to minimize the situation. They might have a bad relationship or distrust of law enforcement. So, of course, there's a variety of reasons that this happens. But one that I want to highlight is that there's a lack of awareness that stalking even is a crime that could be reported to law enforcement. So, when it's happening, it's not necessarily a decision, should I call the police, yes or no? That thought often doesn't cross a victim's mind because they don't realize what's happening to them is actually criminal and that there is something to report. But let's say they do report. So this was a small study, almost 2,000 cases of domestic violence. Of these, almost 300 involved stalking, about 1 in 6. So here we have clear evidence of stalking. So in the chat box, I would just like to hear your guesses. How many of these 298 cases do you think were charged as stalking? How many do you think got a stalking charge out of that 298? Let's see, mine says folks are typing, so I'll give you a second. 29, 50, 20, 5, 2, less than 100. 1. That's right. This one person got it. 1. Actually, 1 case was charged as stalking out of this nearly 300. And this isn't to be overly critical of law enforcement, just only 1 case was charged. But because a lot of folks aren't thinking about what they're seeing as stalking and charging it and holding those offenders accountable. But it's okay, we're going to fix it during this webinar and as we continue to talk about stalking. So what we'll be doing today is understanding the definition, dynamics, and prevalence of stalking. We'll talk about stalking behaviors as well as how they intersect and manifest, especially with adolescents. And then we'll consider some strategies to protect victims and hold offenders accountable. So what is stalking? I keep saying it's so bad we have to do something. What is it exactly? So I'm going to skip this real quick. For stalking, there is a behavioral definition and a legal definition. I'm going to focus today on the behavioral definition because we're a national audience and it's really important to look at your local stalking statute and see how it compares to that behavioral definition. Because sometimes something is stalking behaviorally, but you may not be able to charge it as stalking because some of the statutes are quite narrow. Regardless of what your statute says, though, it's really critical to recognize stalking behaviorally because even if you can't charge it, it's its own risk, it's its own crime, and we need to be able to keep victims safe, right? And be able to let them know what they're experiencing and what that might mean. And so I always start with the behavioral definition, and that's what we'll focus on today. So I have these 3 scenarios for you. We're doing them as 3 polls. And all of these scenarios describe a negative behavior. So we don't like any of them. But what I'd like you to do is vote and let me know which ones of these are stalking. It could be all of them, some of them, none of them. So Daniel, if you could pull up the first poll here in this scenario. Student climbs a fence, peeks into the women's locker room to see the girls undress. Does that sound like stalking to you? Let's see, I'll give you... So on mine, most folks are saying no, but we split the room, about a third saying yes. Okay. Okay, so thanks. So we're not sure, but most people are saying no. Okay, next situation, next scenario, please. An ex-partner repeatedly spreads vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. Does this sound like stalking? Yes or no? Give you a few seconds. Okay, it looks like more folks are saying yes here, but still about a fifth saying no. Okay, and last but not least, the scenario with a terrible supervisor. School administrator regularly asks her assistant personal questions, mocks him in meetings, sends emails at odd hours, is verbally abusive when he doesn't respond right away. Does this sound like stalking? Yes or no? Okay, so we're seeing most people say yes, but also some split here. Okay, thanks. So in those scenarios, I know you had to kind of think fast, but a few questions might have occurred to you, like, okay, does it have to be at one person, or could it be at anyone, like any of the girls, or how many times would this have had to happen? And so luckily for you, I'm going to go over the behavioral definition right now and use these scenarios in there to help explain that and answer some of those questions. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So it is a pattern of behavior, not a single incident or a one-off event. And that's called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So today you might hear me use those terms kind of interchangeably, pattern of behavior, course of conduct. I'm really talking about the same thing, which is that two or more incidents that make up that stalking pattern of behavior. And these behaviors can be quite varied. So let's say I'm stalking Jennifer because I'm the worst presenter ever. Okay. So maybe Monday, I text her all day. Tuesday, I feel bad she didn't respond. So I'm angry. I break her windows. Then Wednesday, I feel guilty. I send her flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors, even though texting somebody or sending a gift would not be criminal. They can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. So a lot of times stalkers combine behaviors that are crimes on their own, like property damage, right? She could call the police about that smashed window or vandalism. A lot of stalkers are combining that with other behaviors that are not obviously illegal. And a lot of them know how to toe that line. And so that's how they can get away with it and confuse victims about if they should report or not. So again, those behaviors could become criminal in the context of a stalking case. So it's a pattern of behavior, more than one incident, and it's directed at a specific person. So if you think about that first scenario where the student is looking into the girls' locker room, that might still be a crime. But if that student was looking at whoever happened to be in, whichever girls happened to be in the locker room, that's not really stalking because it's not directed at a specific person. Now, it could become stalking. Let's say that student then identifies women from the locker room, does some research, contacts them online, and says, you better XYZ, or I will, I'm going to take pictures of you next time, or harasses them further, right? So if that offender continues to contact them, or if the offender followed a specific girl into the locker room and then watched her undress, okay, that could become a stalking case because you're adding another component and it's now directed at a specific person. But just the act, and I don't say just to minimize it, but the sole act of peeking into the locker room is not really stalking because it's not directed at a specific person. It's also only a one-time event that we know of in this scenario. So doing that once, while again, perhaps still criminal, would not really be stalking because we'd have to be adding another incident or behavior to it. So it's a pattern of behavior. It's directed at a specific person, though I will say we often see what we call target dispersion, which is maybe a stalker is stalking, let's say, their ex-partner. That ex-partner starts dating somebody new. Okay, so now the ex is targeting the victim, their ex, and the victim's new partner. So, and certainly it's very common for a stalker to reach out to a victim's family, friends, co-workers, classmates. So a lot of people can become involved in a stalking case and even be considered co-victimized in that way, but it's still in the context and purpose of reaching that one individual. That is, they are trying to get to that victim and they'll use other people to do it. So behaviorally, we would still say that's directed at a specific person. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. So fear is really critical to the definition of stalking, and it's actually what separates stalking from a crime it's confused with, which is harassment. So if you think about that third scenario with the school administrator who's just being terrible to her employee, harassment's typically the sort of repeated behavior that would make a reasonable person feel angry, annoyed, disrespected, upset, and harassment can be quite serious. So I'm not trying to minimize that, but it's not necessarily scary. So if my supervisor is emailing me at 2 a.m. and then yelling at me when I haven't responded by 9 a.m., okay, she's the worst. Like, I should talk to HR, right? That's really not okay for her to do. But I'm not necessarily scared of her. Now, if she starts texting my husband, I don't know how she got his number. She starts sending me a picture of myself. She texts me a picture of myself walking my dog, saying, why are you doing that instead of working? ugh, now I'm scared, right? Like, when's she going to stop? This has crossed a real line here. So harassment can become stalking or be part of a stalking course of conduct, but that fear component is really what makes stalking stalking. And it's important because, especially when we're talking about adolescents and high schools, though this applies actually, I guess it applies across the board as well. Sometimes harassment doesn't trigger the same Title IX sort of response as stalking does. Harassment, unless it's sexual harassment, doesn't always get considered a gender-based crime, but stalking does. And so a lot of times people want to call stalking harassment because they don't have to deal with it the same way. And I hear this misused all the time, whether it's for that reason or just a genuine confusion. So I'll read an article that says, she got 50 death threats. It was extreme harassment. Well, I don't know about you. When I get my death threats, I'm not just annoyed. I'm scared, right? So if there's that fear element, we're really talking about stalking. But that's tough, right? Because stalking and fear is quite personal. What's scary to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa. So we're going to watch. This is literally like a 5-second video. I want you to think about which of these folks you identify with more. So Daniel, if you could pull that up. You can stop it there, Daniel. Okay, so some of you might be feeling more like the woman in this video, right? Where you're not having it. You are very upset by the spider. But my guess is a lot of you are resonating a little bit more with this kind of face that we're seeing here. This kind of, can you please calm it down situation, where it's this tiny thing and she's having this huge reaction, right? So most of us can understand why this man feels this way. But what if I told you that last year this woman was bitten by a spider that looked just like that? She had a terrible reaction, went to the hospital, and almost died. Would you still be making this face at her? Some of you are like, yeah, I would, I don't care. But most of you know, right? It's like, calm down, it's this little thing. But when you know the whole story, suddenly we're sympathetic, right? We can understand why this victim's having this reaction, and it doesn't seem so scary after all. So we can end the video here, Daniel. You can get back to the slides. Thank you. So the truth is that context is critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in stalking cases, because a lot of times what seems scary to a victim may seem benign or even nice to you as an outsider. So for example, this was a case where this woman called the police. She's hysterical. And all she would say was, "There's a cup of coffee in my car." So understandably, the police are not sending out the SWAT team. They're not like, they're kind of like, you prefer tea? Like, what is the big deal? And eventually she calms down enough and says, "He's here." It turned out this was a stalking victim. She had relocated to get away from the stalker, address confidentiality, everything, really thought she'd covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that morning. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with his old nickname for her on it. So I can't see or hear you right now, unfortunately, because of the webinar platform. But typically when I say that, people kind of go like, ugh, right? And make an upset face. So if you did that or shook your head or any of those things, what that tells me is a reasonable person would feel fear. I'm being generous and assuming you're reasonable people, right? A reasonable person would feel fear when they know the whole story. But when all you hear is there's coffee in the car, it's like, oh my God, your car comes with coffee. This is amazing. How do I get one of these cars, right? So we need to know the story to understand why it's so scary, and that context is really critical. So with stalking, something might be frightening to the victim, but not to you. And so we need to ask the right questions. We need to say, what about that was scary to you? Tell me more about that. What's the story behind that? What message did that send to you? Because those stalking behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. The classic example is an offender saying, "I'll send you roses the day I kill you." Right? So the victim receives roses, is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying this is so great because of that specific meanings. And again, stalking criminalizes otherwise non-criminal behavior. So it's really the context of these behaviors that makes them stalking in the first place. So if we go back to that video and see what happens, a lot of times if victims, typically there's many studies showing that victims are afraid, that victim fear is an excellent indicator of victim danger. So we can press play on this and see how this plays out here. All right, so in this one, we see this man saying, "Oh, no big deal. Let me go over here and handle this little thing. No biggie." And then, of course, she was the one having the more valid reaction the whole time, right? And so we don't want to be that guy when we're dealing with stalking victims. We don't want to say, "It's just some text messages. No big deal. I got this." And then recognize that actually that victim was very right to be scared. So it goes back to, of course, being victim-centered, believing victims, and realizing if they're scared, there's probably a good reason. If it's not apparent, let's ask them what it is. Thanks, Daniel. Can you go back to the slides, please? But is it fear? So a lot of folks don't love to admit when they're afraid. They may not use that language. And sometimes our fear is masked by other emotions like frustration, anger. Of course, some victims show no affect at all. People react to trauma in different ways. And so, when a victim reaches out to you, they're probably not going to say, "Hi, I'm experiencing a course of conduct that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. I believe you call that stalking," right? Like, if they do say that to you, please call me. I'll be like, "Our awareness efforts are so good." But they probably won't say that, right? They're more likely to say something like, "My ex is being creepy. My friend is making things awkward. My teacher is being weird. My friend is harassing me," right? That's the kind of language they'll use. And so it's really up to us to be thinking, could this be fear and could this be stalking? And like I said earlier, stalking victims are very likely to minimize the situation. So I talked to a law enforcement officer the other week, and he said he got a call from a stalking victim who said, "Today's a great day. He's only driven by my house 8 times." And the law enforcement officer was like, "It's 9 a.m." And the victim was like, "Yeah, but usually by this time he's driven by like 20 times, so this is great." So it's not that that victim is unreasonable, right? But that victim, she is reacting to this repeated trauma. By now what's abnormal and would be scary to most people is become normal to her. So against all that, she's unreasonable. She's just adapting to this repeated trauma. So that's where that reasonable person standard is actually helpful, I think, intellectually, because even if the victim isn't saying, "I am feeling afraid," if those behaviors would cause most of us to feel fear and they've normalized it, we could still be thinking about that as stalking behavior. The thing is, I actually hear the word stalking all the time, just not used correctly. So you've probably heard someone say something like this. Like, "I was totally Facebook stalking you. I saw you went to Mexico. It looked awesome, right?" So assuming these people know each other and are Facebook friends, does this sound like stalking to you all? Um, Hopefully not, right? Hopefully not. And why not? Because there's no fear, right? Like, it's not scary if you post something on social media for friends in that network to look at that thing you posted. Like, that's not scary. That's normal, right? That would not cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Um, and the thing is, we hear this all the time. "I was stalking you on Instagram. Oh my God, I was stalking you. I saw your plans. Oh, we ran into each other. I promise I'm not stalking you. Ha ha ha," right? And while this doesn't cause stalking, it does kind of dilute the meaning and the seriousness of the term stalking as a crime that is traumatic, criminal, and dangerous, right? And it's a bit unique to this crime. Like, people don't say, "Oh man, that party was so lit. It's arson." Right? That's not a thing people say. If you say there was arson at my home, people are, "Oh man, you should call the police. Like, arson's very serious. That's a crime." But with stalking, you get this like, okay, but was it stalking or was it stalking? And people are less likely to take it seriously, to report it, to talk to their friends about it is also the big piece, right? With all of us, including young people, they're more likely to talk to their peers before they talk to any of us as responders. And so is that friend saying, "Oh, that's serious, let's do something," or are they saying, "Was it stalking or was it stalking?" So I encourage you to think about your use of that term and also its impact on victims and their reporting, as well as us as responders and how we can also sometimes minimize the situation and not recognize it as the criminal, traumatic, dangerous thing that it is. Do you have any questions on the behavioral definition of stalking before I move on here and talk a little bit about stalking prevalence and behavior, or really behaviors. I'll give you a second in the chat box. Nope. I nailed it. You loved it. Okay, cool. So, stalking prevalence and behavior. Stalking is really prevalent crime. More than 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men experience stalking in the lifetime. And I want to say up front, the reason I'm talking about this in such a binary gender way is because that's the best available data, and it asks people to identify their gender as women and men, or are you a woman, are you a man, and then what happened. And so we know that stalking impacts people across the gender spectrum, but this is the best available data, so that's what I have to repeat here to you. So more than 1 in 6 women, and this is using a really conservative definition of stalking. And what I mean by that is that this is the NISVS data, and it asked victims if they felt very afraid that they or someone close to them would be physically harmed. So that's a really high threshold, right? That what if you're afraid of being followed but not harmed? What if you're afraid that you're kind of afraid but not very afraid, right? Even with that really high benchmark, we have 1 in 6 women saying, yes, I've experienced that. When they piloted it and taken out that very, the rates are closer to 1 in 4 women. But even if we take this conservative definition here, we know that, sexual assault impacts around 1 in 5 women. Domestic violence impacts about 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women, depending what study you read. So stalking's right up there in terms of the prevalence, and that's why I know that you're already serving victims of stalking, and yet we have that and stalking, first stalking training, very few national stalking resources. And so it's just one of those things that's really overlooked in our field. So it's very prevalent, and it can start young. So about half of victims were first stalked before age 25. And this small study showed that about 1 in 5 teen girls and 14% of teen boys experienced stalking before the age of 18 or during the age of 18. So I will say, with all the teen-specific data that I'm presenting, there is a dearth of research. There's not tons and tons of research. And so this was one of the bigger ones. It was in Kentucky. It was thousands of students, self-identifying, self-reporting. So I'm happy to send you these studies, but that's the best available research we have. But there's no national comprehensive study on adolescent stalking. And I think that's for a few reasons. One is that there's just less research on stalking generally than there is on other crimes, and also because of the complications of doing research with minors, right? And so I want to say that up front as I present this data, that it's the best we have that I know of, and it's limited. So want to be transparent about that. So people of all gender identities experience stalking, but women report experiencing it at much higher rates than men do. And the majority of stalking victims report that the offender is male. This is true overwhelmingly for female victims. Over 80% of the time the offender is male. It's also true about half the time for male victims where the offender is male. So outside of an LGBT context, why might that be happening, do you think? And I think one of the major reasons is we have men stalking the new partners of their ex-girlfriends, right? So that stalking that, and that's not all of it, but that is a great deal of it. So we have a lot of men stalking other men outside of that context. We know that stalking does happen in the LGBT community as well. Through small studies and anecdotally, it seems the rates might be even higher than in the general population, similar to dating violence and sexual violence, but we don't have a great national study on it yet. When I look for images of stalking, which I do because I'm fun, so if I Google stalking, these are the kind of pictures I get. And so, you get a lot of these sort of hooded, sort of strangers lurking in alleyways. My favorite's this person in the middle. He's wearing a mask and a hoodie and behind a computer, but did not cover their webcam. So you get the sense of these kind of ominous strangers following you. And I'm sure it will not surprise any of you on this call to know the vast majority of the time, the victim knows the offender knows the victim. Stalkers know their victims know their stalkers, right? But I will tell you that when I'm talking about stalking outside of our field, because I'm fun at parties and stuff, people are shocked by this, because when most people think about stalking, they think about celebrities. They're thinking Taylor Swift, they're thinking the Kardashians, and those are the stalking stories that so often make the news and are called stalking. And in fact, our stalking laws do come from a celebrity stalking case. It was Rebecca Schaeffer's murder in the 90s that led California to pass the first stalking law in the country. So that's not wrong, but it's not really what we're talking about. But just as with sexual assault, sometimes we have victims saying, oh, it wasn't rape because I know that person. Victims say that with stalking too. Oh, it's not stalking, that's just my ex. They're just having a hard time with it or whatever. When we in the field know that that's the most likely person to be the offender, right? Are those people that we know? This is for the adults. About half the time, the offender is a current or former intimate partner. So that's about 40% of the time for male victims, over 60% of the time for female victims. But I want to pause here and also make the point that if about half the time the stalker is a current or former intimate partner, that also means about half the time they aren't, right? They're an acquaintance, they might be a stranger, a family member, or a person of authority like a supervisor, a teacher, a professor. And so a lot of times when we're approaching stalking, we're coming from that domestic violence perspective. And that's not wrong, but it is a little bit incomplete because our stalking resources tend to be housed under our domestic violence resources. That's true for victim services and for law enforcement. It's usually a subdivision. So if I'm being stalked by my neighbor or by an old friend of my same gender, am I likely to call someone called the Family Violence Center? Right? Probably not. It wouldn't occur to me, even if that's the best place to go. So I encourage you all to think about, are you serving all victims of stalking? If you are, awesome. Would they know how to find you? If you're not, do you know where to refer them? And do you have a clear policy on that? Can stalking victims being stalked by someone not intimate partner related come into shelter, for example? And so we have a checklist on our website that asks some of those questions just to consider in terms of your organizational response. But we want to make sure that we're serving all victims of stalking. And I know it's asking you to do another thing when you're already doing so much work. But the stalking response, like I said, it's under all of that violence against women funding, and there's not another response available, so it falls to us. For teens, it's a little bit different. So in this study, and again, this is a study of, this one was in Australia, and it was about 200 teens, and this is looking at case files. They had a protective order, so I just want to contextualize it a little bit. But we're seeing the numbers look a little bit different here. So instead of about half intimate partners, it's about a fifth of intimate partners, and we're seeing it's more likely that it's a peer acquaintance, like a classmate, or a school peer, sorry, those are two separate categories. Family or peer acquaintance, family friend, someone your dad knows, that kind of thing, an estranged friend, or school peer. So the numbers here are looking different, and among teens, we're seeing even less intimate partner stalking, though it still is a significant piece of the pie, right, than we do with adults. And this really split differently for teen girls and teen boys when they subdivided it. So as you can see here, when the offender is male, we're seeing more intimate partner offenders, right? About 28%. But for female offenders, you're seeing about that same for estranged friends, someone you used to be friends with. And it's almost swapped exactly with intimate partner and friend. I know it's a little hard when I can't point to this, but if you look at this estranged, like for female offenders, only 7% are stalking an ex-partner, but 30% are stalking an ex-friend, and it's like the opposite for male offenders. Almost 30% are stalking an ex-intimate, 7% are stalking an estranged friend. For both, school peers are taking up about a fourth of it, and acquaintances, and a very small percentage of strangers. And so we want, again, to be thinking about that intimate partner stalking and stalking's relationship with teen dating violence. And I will talk specifically about that. It's absolutely really, really critical for a variety of reasons. But a lot of times teens aren't calling it stalking, even though actually it is stalking. And it's happening among these different groups. So I want to make sure that we see that here. So stalking behaviors. There are so many stalking behaviors, and I do not mean this as a compliment to stalkers, but stalkers are extremely creative criminals. People always tell me the most bizarre, disturbing, strange cases are stalking cases. So Like, I read a case where an offender drove 300 miles to carve his ex's name in the trees near her home. That's a stalking case, right? I read a case where a stalker sent a snake in the mail to his ex with an aggressive note and then pled not guilty to stalking. You're like, we know you sent the snake in the mail, though. So, again, it's the most bizarre things. Um, so this is a really helpful, I think, framework from researcher T.K. Logan, who's a really great researcher on stalking, called SLY, that helps us just expand our thinking on the wide variety of stalking behaviors. Because a lot of times when folks think stalking, they think surveillance. And surveillance is often part of stalking, but it's not the only thing, because it can be any behavior. It could be repeated behavior or a combination of different behaviors that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Surveillance isn't the only thing that scares us, right? And so, so I'm going to give you just a few examples of each one of these, and these categories overlap, and that's okay. Surveillance is how is the offender tracking, monitoring, watching, gathering information on that victim. Life invasion is how is the offender showing up in the victim's life where the victim does not want that person to be there. Interference is what is the victim actually losing, changing, or afraid of losing or changing as a result of that stalking behavior? What's changing for the victim? And intimidation, implicitly or explicitly, how is that offender intimidating the victim? So just a few big examples to go over, though of course they're endless, really. With surveillance, we often see a combination of the use of technology and in-person strategies. So a lot of times people think right to tracking software, spyware, planting a GPS on a car or in someone's purse, and all of that absolutely is really common. But most stalkers who stalk using technology are also stalking in person. So that good old-fashioned following, watching, waiting, especially when we're thinking about teens and their geographic world, can be a bit small, right? They're in high school. We know where they have class. We know their schedule. We know that they have soccer practice at 3:15. And so it's actually very easy for an offender to know where that person will be and to access them in a lot of cases, right? And so a lot of them are combining that technology. They might also hack into accounts to gain access to, their social media accounts, their email, to get information about them that way. We also see proxy stalking. So stalking is stalking through other people. So especially with teens, I would argue, you see this all the time where it's stalking through a friend, for example. So, oh, I haven't seen, Julie in a while. Is she seeing anyone new? Did her family end up going to Disney for a vacation? Like that kind of thing where you're getting information through other people. And this can happen online as well, right? Sometimes we see stalkers impersonate somebody using a social media platform and then gather information that way. So it seems like they're in the same circle of friends, or they are in the same circle of friends. And those shared social networks can make it really hard for stalking victims to get away from that offender and to keep information private. Life invasion includes unwanted contact. So think about the way your life is being invaded by this stalker. You're trying to get through your day, no matter what you do. There's a text, there's an email, there's a Snapchat, whatever it might be, repeated phone calls, just they're letting you know they're there and they're trying to reach you all the time, and it feels really invasive. Also, property invasion. So the car in the person's home. This is really common with stalking cases. And in fact, if you ever have a victim say to you, I know it sounds crazy, but that might be a stalking case because stalkers intentionally do a lot of things that aren't obviously violent or harmful, but that are really scary to that victim. So, for example, one really invasive tactic that could also be interfering here is that stalkers love to break into a victim's home or vehicle and not take or break anything, but just leave some sign that they were there. So maybe they leave the TV on a channel that they and the victim used to watch together, or they move a lamp, or they leave all the lights on, or something like that that sends a message to that victim. So when the victim gets home or they get into their car, they know the offender was there, but they don't feel they can prove it because what are they going to do? Call the police and say someone moved a lamp? Right? So offenders know that, and that's why they engage in that behavior, and it feels really invasive because it's sending a message that they can get to you. And yet there's often little evidence to show that it happened. Public humiliation and spreading rumors. That's a really common stalker tactic. And if you remember way back when I started talking, we had those three scenarios. And one was an ex-partner repeatedly spreads vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. Is that stalking, yes or no? Of course, it would depend on the situation, but spreading rumors and public humiliation is a really common invasive and interfering tactic. Um, and you might be thinking, well, how can spreading rumors be a crime? Like people gossip, you know. But if you think about ruining reputation and humiliating that person, so for example, I read a case where an offender photoshopped images of the victim's face onto like a pornographic image, wrote a bunch of rumors about what that victim liked sexually, and where to find that victim, made a flyer, distributed it to everyone in her workplace and apartment building. Okay, so obviously that's more than people gossip, right? That's spreading a lie that is humiliating, that is invasive, and that can have a real impact and interfere. So I'll move on to interference here on that person's life. And her ability to get work and to be safe, and people might find her and all of that. And so that spreading rumors or acts of public humiliation, trying to socially isolate the person, that can also be stalking. So interference, which I already mentioned a little bit, it could be that spreading rumors, also financial and work sabotage. So, you know, we have a young person working at Starbucks after school, and then they call the manager. The stalker calls the manager and complains about that person's customer service. Or they just show up at the workplace and are so annoying that the employer says, okay, you've got to go because we can't have this person here. Uh, Custody interference might be a little less relevant, though of course we do have teen parents as well. And we see that all the time with stalking cases, continuing to interfere in terms of custody, keeping from leaving with road rage, attacking family or friends, and of course an actual attack, as well as property damage. I would also add here interfering in terms of online accounts. We see that quite a bit with our adolescent stalking victims. And if you think about just all the accounts you have online, one thing I want to mention is we talk about password safety, and password safety is really important. But a lot of times it's also those security questions, because if you're like me, you can never remember your password. So what do? You say, forgot my password, and then you get a set of security questions. And those questions tend to be things like, what's your father's middle name? What's your high school mascot? And we tend to answer those truthfully because we can't remember we can't remember our password, right? But who else knows that information? Well, the stalker, especially if they were an intimate partner, a family member, or just a good stalker. And so we suggest that not only do people change their passwords, but also change those security questions when possible. Um, and we want people to be able to remember them. So maybe it's a song lyric or something like that, but not truthful. So, but if you just think about all the accounts that teens have online, and of course, teens have different accounts online, but anything from their social media, finances, email, school accounts, we have stalkers in there taking out money, making purchases, spreading rumors, signing them up for things, signing them out of things, swapping classes, all of that kinds of stuff. We also see quite a bit of impersonation. So all you need to make a social media or dating profile is a photo and an email. And so if they can get a photo of the victim and set up an email, it's really easy to pretend to be that person and, you know, spread a bunch of rumors, ruin that person's reputation, encourage violence, all sorts of things. So that can be stalking as well. And then intimidation, right? Implicit or explicit. So threats, property damage, forced confrontations. When an offender threatens to harm themselves or a pet or somebody else, we know that that's also a very huge risk to the victim. Oh, and with interference as well, property damage, very little interference, right? Someone slashes a tire. Well, now I can't drive to school because my tire's slashed. I have to deal with this, right? So all those kinds of things. So I can go on and on about stalking behaviors. This is just the very beginning of a list. When we do this training in person, we have people brainstorm, and there's so many odd ones you hear. But the point here is to really, again, think broadly about stalking behaviors and also how they can work together, right? So if an offender is watching somebody so they know where they are going, then they show up there and invade their life, and then the victim's going to change that pattern. So now it's interfered because they're intimidated. So these overlap, and a lot of times offenders are using more than one. And I just encourage you to think beyond surveillance. Think about all the different behaviors that could actually be stalking. And if you're wondering about one, I'm happy to talk to you about it after the call. So most offenders use more than one behavior, right? About 80% are using more than one means of approach. They're not just following, they're not just texting, they're doing a variety of things. 2/3 of stalkers pursue their victims at least once per week. Many pursue daily. And this really shocked me when I learned this. The average duration of an intimate partner stalking case, not the high end, the average, is 2 years. I'm sorry. Yeah, is 2 years, and about 10% of cases last 5 years or more. So stalkers have plenty of time to start with one thing and then go away for a while, but now they're back. And it looks like they're de-escalating, and maybe they are, or maybe they're gearing up for the next thing. And so it can be a very long-term case that we need to consider here with a lot of different tactics that they can combine. One intersection a bit unique to adolescence I want to address is bullying. I think there's been a lot of attention to bullying recently and anti-bullying efforts. And I encourage you to think about what is bullying versus what is stalking, especially because, like I said earlier, a lot of the stalking we're seeing is not happening with intimate partners among the adolescent population. It's former friends, acquaintances, etc. So the HHS website on bullying describes it as unwanted aggressive behavior among school-aged children that involves a real or perceived power imbalance. The behavior is repeated or has the potential to be repeated over time. So in terms of relating that to the stalking definition, okay, it's unwanted, it's aggressive, there's a power and control dynamic here, right, with this power imbalance. The potential to be repeated wouldn't be a stalking case, but if the behavior is repeated at least once, that could really be stalking. So the line there is a little bit difficult to blur. And some of the examples they give are making threats, spreading rumors, attacking physically. And so those all absolutely could be stalking behaviors, right? And here's a few more examples that they gave. So that excluding someone from a group on purpose, that's unlikely to be stalking. But two or more of any of these could really be stalking. And so we want to, again, when we're thinking about stalking versus bullying, it's contextual, but stalking is a crime on a different level than bullying. Stalking often triggers Title IX considerations, and stalking has its own risk factors. And so if something's stalking, we want to call it stalking, not bullying, and be thinking about what's what. Of course, it can be a little bit hard to tell, and I'm sorry, it looks like this slide got a little caught off in the upload here. Is it stalking? Is it bullying? Is it romantic pursuit? And so a few examples of where the lines might get blurred. Like, let's say student brings flowers to every a cappella concert that you're in, leaves good luck and congrats notes for you. Is that stalking? Is it bullying? Is it, if it's meant ironically, is it romantic pursuit? What if they send multiple texts a day to check in, regardless of whether or not you respond? What if they stole things like your textbook and jacket, so you had to get them back? Could that be stalking, right? They're interfering with your life. Could it be bullying? They're taking things from you to bother you, to make your life difficult. They're just being mean. Or is it romantic pursuit? Oh, they're flirting, and now, oh no, you have to get your jacket back, right? And so, and even this last one that's threatening, again, probably not romantic pursuit unless it's really being done badly. That's stalking, bullying. So there's no clear answers here, and the reason that I bring these up isn't to tell you it's always stalking, though of course sometimes it is, but to say that there needs to be an intersection and an education around when we're talking about anti-bullying efforts. Let's bring stalking into that conversation, because stalking is actually a criminal behavior that has its own risks. And so the context is really what changes scenarios like this from stalking to bullying to romantic pursuit. But let's introduce that word stalking and see what's what. Oh, that's right. We have a video here. So Daniel, if you can pull that up. This is a news clip, and I apologize to folks on the call. You won't be able to hear it. That includes, and you'll hear they conflate these terms. They're talking about bullying, stalking, and harassment, and showing just how serious it can be. So we're going, I think it's just a couple minutes long to give that a watch. If you can start that. Yep, go ahead. Thanks.
Go to learn and
interesting is that we're seeing all these terms conflated. They're saying they didn't protect her from this bully, And then the school district is saying, we take harassment really seriously. And it's like, what are we talking about here? And some of the behaviors that they mentioned are things that we would more commonly associate with bullying or just kind of high school shenanigans, like egging the house, right? And so this is just a call to really take that seriously, to call it what it is, and to recognize that these really could be stalking behaviors, and to contextualize it that way when people are so concerned about bullying. Again, is it stalking, and how are we using those terms, and are we being mindful about that? And also, are we using the right term to trigger the right response, essentially? So in terms of stalking and violence, there is definitely a relationship. This was a study of teen girl offenders. Okay, so what it found was that basically stalking was an indicator that these teens were engaging in other kinds of violence. Now, this of course doesn't mean that the stalking is causing violence, just that it's an indicator that it's the same person who's engaging in stalking is more likely to be engaging in these other violent behaviors. So for teen girls, basically it gave a list of different stalking behaviors. So for teen girls who engage in some of those stalking behaviors, they're more likely to have weapon use, physical and sexual teen dating violence, assault, teacher violence, threats, and intimidation. Now for boys, it was a little bit different. So what they did was they separated between boys who were not perpetrators. So they looked at this list of stalking behaviors and said, nope, I haven't done any of those. Those were not perpetrators. Then there's perpetrators who engage in some stalking behaviors. And then about 6% were comprehensive perpetrators. And these were boys who engaged in every kind of stalking behavior. There were no girls who met that criteria. So let's start here, and then I will remove this blue box soon. But so if we look here at the difference between all these kinds of violence, for boys who were not perpetrators of stalking to ones who were, it's clear they were much more likely to engage in, let's look here at just about all of these, some quite significantly, to physically hurt others. We're going from 0.05 to 0.19, almost 4 times as likely. To engage in peer violence, they're almost twice as likely. Teacher violence, 4 times as likely. Weapon use. So really across the board here, they're more likely to be engaging in those violent behaviors. So what if we now take a look at our comprehensive perpetrators? So we have our not perpetrators who still might engage in some of this violence. We have our perpetrators doing some stalking behaviors who can be more violent. Our comprehensive perpetrators, wow, we really see the rates go up quite significantly. And so again, this is not to say that stalking is causing these other types of violence, but it is an indicator that this young person is engaged in a variety of violent behaviors. Because if we look at the jump here from not perpetrators to some stalking behaviors to all the stalking behaviors, it's really, really striking. Especially look at this sexual assault from, or actually that one's a less good example because it's the only outlier. We look at assault from 0.1%, 0.16%, 0.69%, right? We're seeing it go up and up. And so we definitely want to know when a teen is stalking because there might be more going on. In terms of intimate partner violence specifically, a lot of times in our field, I'll hear people say, oh, it was an abusive relationship, and then it's often as she left, and then he began stalking her. And that can happen, absolutely. But let's take a step back. If during the relationship he was following her, demanding check-ins, tracking her, asking friends and family where she was, showing up at her workplace, showing up at her school, that's domestic violence and it is stalking. It is both. And often what we call emotional abuse, if it happens to fall under those categories, or digital abuse is really stalking. I mean, what is digital abuse? It is power and control being facilitated remotely in a repeated way that would make someone afraid. That's stalking. And it can happen before, during, and or after a relationship. Overall, it's happening during the relationship over half the time. And so it's actually a really powerful thing to recognize because so often we know that emotional abuse is devastating for victims, and yet it's hard to actually prosecute it, right? Because unfortunately, it's not illegal to just be terrible to somebody else. But if those emotionally and digitally abusive behaviors include stalking behaviors, well, stalking is a crime, and we can do something about it. So it can be a really great tool to recognize that. We also want to know when our intimate partner stalkers are stalking because on average, while all stalkers can be dangerous, absolutely, on average, our intimate partner stalkers pose the greatest threats to their victims. So they're more likely to physically approach, be insulting, interfering, and threatening, use weapons, have their behaviors escalate quickly, and while the recidivism rate is high across the board, is even higher for those intimate partner stalkers. Not only are intimate partner stalkers our most dangerous stalkers, but stalkers who are intimate partners are our most dangerous intimate partners. And what I mean by that is really illustrated by this particular study. This was a study of women with protective orders. So all of them have been abused by an intimate partner. Some of them have been abused and stalked. For those women who were abused and stalked, they had higher rates of all of these things and more, from verbal abuse to sexual assault, threats with a weapon, being beat up, attacks with a weapon, and injury. They had much higher rates of this, significantly higher rates than women who were abused but not stalked. And so again, it's not that stalking is causing it, but it's an indicator when we see stalking in an intimate partner violence case, that should be a huge red flag that there might be something else going on here, that there might be further violence, etc. And again, those lethality risks. And 76% have completed, 85% have attempted intimate partner femicide, but they were stalking the year prior to that event. And perhaps teens, when they may not know this study, know that because adolescent victims, when they're interviewed about which stalkers were most scary, they were most afraid when the stalker was a former intimate partner. So adolescents are sensing that those are the people who are most likely to hurt them, which is true statistically. We are going to, sorry, I forgot that Danielle had to pull up this video. We're going to go ahead and watch this short video. This is a stalking victim who experienced a lot of relationship violence as a teen, and it just illustrates just how scary these intimate partner stalkers can be. All right, I'm going to stop it there. So again, obviously a disturbing case, a lot of different indicators of violence. Absolutely, there's violence before the breakup as well. But I do want to highlight these stalking behaviors as well, because what turns out happening in this case is that he, he's sentenced, there's a protective order, he violates it, he approaches her anyways, he continues to text her, continues to follow her, continues, and then eventually breaks into her home at a time when he knows she'll be there because of that surveillance and tries to kill her, tries to burn her room down and house down. You saw some glimpses of that at the beginning. Um, and so it's good that she was able to survive. And now, if you want to watch, I'm happy to link you the whole story and there's more detail about it. But he's sentenced to 29 to 60 years in prison, which is a pretty strong sentence, as we know, comparatively to some other domestic violence and stalking charges. And they asked Sophia, this is just a quote from the interview, does she think he'll come after for her once he gets out? And she says, yeah, 100% I think he will. What can she do about it? Hide, change my name, move out of the state. I'm going to do that. I'm terrified. And I think this goes so much to that persistence that stalking offenders are often utilizing, that they will keep finding that victim, and whether they actually do or not, they create the feeling for victims that there's no way to get away from them, that they can always come back, that they can always reach out again. So even with what we would consider, many of us might consider like a pretty successful sentencing, this nightmare is still not over for her, right? Because she's saying, yeah, 30 years from now, I'm gonna be afraid. And so just the trauma there. And so the reason I showed this video, and again, apologies for a little bit of the sensational nature of it, but to, of course, take teen dating violence really seriously, because I think sometimes it gets kind of relegated as, oh, it's like the mini version of domestic violence, when it's the exact same thing as domestic violence and can be just as deadly. And also to be identifying the violence and the potential lethality that can come with that. Again, I often see it called breakup violence. It's called that, but really what we're talking about is stalking. You probably are familiar with that statistic. It takes an average of 7 times for a domestic violence victim to leave an abusive relationship. Well, what's that about? That's really about stalking more times than not, right? It may not always, but often it's about that continued outreach and continuing to bring that person back and that persistence. So we definitely want to be taking our intimate partner violence cases. Of course, we want to take all of our stalking cases seriously, including our non-intimate cases. That's the majority of teen cases. And when we have stalking and intimate partner violence for teens or adults, that should be a huge red flag that there might be more going on here. In terms of sexual violence, it can intersect with that as well in a few different ways. The stalker might be planning to sexually assault the victim, so they're stalking them to learn their habits when they might be home alone, that kind of thing. They might try to get someone else to sexually assault the victim. I'll give you an example of that in a second. They might engage in sexual assault. They might perpetrate sexual assault as part of that pattern of behavior, or they might contact them after the sexual assault, and that's actually where it becomes stalking. So I encourage you to think about grooming generally as stalking. And so there can be a lot of different kinds of sexual violence teens might experience, from uh, rape to trafficking to grooming for child pornography. But all of these kind of offenders are broadly following that same pattern of behavior. So first, they're going to research and identify vulnerable victims. For someone who is looking to exploit a child, for example, they might go online, identify children that seem vulnerable, perhaps because of their immigration status or disability or their race or something like that. They're going to perhaps and identify them and see who looks vulnerable. And that's what perhaps an older high school student might be doing to a younger high school student as well, finding the freshman, who doesn't know, have as much experience with drinking or partying or whatever it might be. Then they're going to establish a relationship. So if we stick with that child predator online, they might be saying, oh, I understand you better than your parents do. They're going to have multiple contacts to build trust, same as that older classmate, would be building that relationship. Then they're at some point going to meet in person and isolate the victim in order to coerce them into a sexual act or multiple sexual acts. At that point, they might be involving drugs or alcohol, maybe or maybe not, but they are going to meet, isolate the victim, and then contact them after. Either to say, thanks for a great time, or you better keep doing this, or I'll release these images, or you better not tell anyone, or some conflation of all of those. So I know I'm speaking kind of broadly and conflating some different kinds of victimizations, but typically that is how offenders are grooming for sexual violence, right? These repeat offenders. And so if you think about that with the lens of stalking, is it a pattern of behavior? Yes. Is it directed at a specific person? Yeah, they are targeting specific victims. And would it cause a reasonable person to feel fear? Well, yeah, most people are afraid of sexual violence, and even in more restrictive statutes where they have to be afraid of bodily harm, typically sexual assault is included, right? And you might be thinking, but when though? Because on day one, that child or that young teen may not have been afraid when what they thought was a new friend or romantic prospect contacted them, right? They said, oh, I wasn't afraid. I was flattered that the senior was talking to me, right? But fear can attach at any time. There's no stalking statute that says when fear has to attach. So if a victim's looking back and saying, yeah, at first I thought it was great, but now that I look back, I realize the entire relationship was set up for my sexual victimization, and that's terrifying, that could still be considered a stalking case. So why name stalking? I keep saying we have to call it stalking. Is this stalking? Call it stalking. And you might be thinking like, okay, I get, Dana, you care that we call it stalking. You're like coming from the stalking place, but why do I care? Well, it's more than just an intellectual thing to think about. It has some very, very practical reasons that you're going to want to do that. The first one I've already mentioned a little bit, and that's around charging and prosecution. It's its own crime. It can be charged and prosecuted as its own crime. And there can be accountability under the stalking statute that maybe we're missing under some of those other things, right? When we see emotional abuse, digital abuse, if that's stalking, perhaps we can charge it as stalking. It's also a really, really great charge when prosecutors use it, especially in an abuse case. So, and I'll tell you why. So, let's say they are prosecuting an episode of assault, right? They're prosecuting one incident of assault or battery. They can't bring in that time 2 years ago that the offender stood outside the window sending creepy pictures, right? Because they're going to say that's prejudicial, that's not relevant to this incident of assault. But if they're charging stalking, you can bring in the entire course of conduct. So now all of a sudden everything's relevant, and you can actually create a much fuller picture of exactly just how terrible that offender is. And I've talked to plenty of prosecutors who have said, oh yeah, the jury didn't convict on that night where there was a physical attack. They convicted on those disturbing details that you can't get out of your head, that he drove 200 miles to carve her name into a tree, right? And so actually prosecuting stalking is a great strategy because you can bring all that in. Also, safety planning. Like I said, stalking has its own risks. It's a red flag that more is going on here that is both traumatic and physically violent. And so when we see stalking behaviors, we want to be thinking broadly about all the different stalking behaviors that we talked about under that, that surveillance, life invasion, etc. Because if a stalker's doing one thing, they're probably doing other things as well. And we can be quite incident based, both in our law enforcement response and our victim advocacy response sometimes. A victim is concerned about a certain thing that happened, like property damage. We respond and safety plan around how to keep that car safe. But we want to take a step back and be thinking broadly and creatively, because unfortunately stalkers do, about the wide variety of stalking behaviors that might be happening, so we can safety plan around them and recognize the risk appropriately. And victim empowerment. It can go a really long way for a victim to be able to say, instead of my ex has gotten creepy or my neighbor's being weird, to actually say, I'm experiencing stalking. And this is a real thing, and there are resources available, and this is a crime. Even if they don't go forward in the criminal justice system, even if that's all they do, being able to name that victimization can also be really empowering. So for all those reasons and more, I think the language is really important to actually name stalking when we see it. So a few big picture points here for responding to victims. Of course, there's more we can say about this. You want to advise disengagement, and that's because stalkers see any contact as a win. So if they call the victim 100 times and the victim picks up and says, I hate you, never call me again, tomorrow they're calling 101 times because that was a win to them. That being said, disengagement's not always possible or realistic. And I know there are prosecutors' offices that will throw out a case. There are clerks that will throw out a protective order if they hear that the victim reached out to the offender. So let's think about that. We got a call about a case where a victim, it was being prosecuted, and they found out the victim called the offender at 2 a.m. and talked for hours. So of course the defense is saying, well, how scared could she be? If she's so scared, why'd she call him? So we asked the victim, and the victim said, well, yeah, I knew he got off working at the bar at 2 a.m. So I called him. I heard him drive home, get into bed, fall asleep. I knew he wouldn't come over, break my windows, and wake up my kids. So she's reaching out because she's afraid, and it's about that keep your enemies closer. So is it ideal? No, but that's a very practical part of her safety planning, right? So you want to do both, advise disengagement and let victims know you recognize that's not always realistic. And so let's have an open dialogue about it. Let's safety plan around it, and let's think about that so that it's not a secret that comes out later, right? It's something that they can talk to you about and that you can explain pretty easily. Documentation is really, really key as well. Stalking crimes can last for years across multiple jurisdictions, and a lot of times stalking victims feel like every call is the first call because it can be these relatively minor events that they're calling about. There's not always the right reporting. We know that our law enforcement, sometimes the Monday doesn't talk to the weekend shift. Sometimes the day guys don't talk to the night guys. I mean, that's just the reality. And so we always say document, 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 but we don't always tell people how to document, right? So they end up saying it was a windy day at home, and it's like, ooh, we don't need this. So here's a stalking incident log. This is for free on our website, and you can adapt it. We have it in Spanish as well. And it asks people to really succinctly just write down date, time, description of incident, location, and that's really jurisdictional issues because victims do not understand jurisdiction. And so they feel like I called the police, and they did, but they don't realize that, oh, well, I called the police, when I was over at my dance practice, and that's actually across the county line. And that department doesn't talk to the one in my hometown. And that was different than talking to my guidance counselor at school, right? But those folks aren't always coordinating. It can be quite frustrating. And so the location's important, as well as if there were witnesses, who they were and who to talk to, if the police were called, the report number and the officer name and badge number. And that's not to be sometimes officers don't like that. They feel like they're about to be, get a complaint or something. And it's not for that. It's just to help that victim connect the dots. And so they can say, well, I talked to this person and here's what the call was. And we always encourage, we do a lot of training for law enforcement to report everything, write up that report, because you're helping the person down the road. Even if it's just something minor like harassing text messages, and then next week it's property damage. If we have two or more, now we have a course of conduct. Now we have a stalking case. But if we never got those text messages documented in the first place, it's the first time every time. And that's something that really frustrates stalking victims and leads them to fall through the cracks. There is a risk assessment specifically for the crime of stalking that I highly, highly recommend. It's free. It's developed by that same researcher who did those SLY strategies, TK Logan. You can access it through our website or at stalkingrisk.org, and you can test it out before you go through it. We also have a recorded webinar of our director, Jen Landheis, going through it on a webinar, so you can see how it works. And basically, this assesses the risk specifically in stalking case for both intimate partner and non-intimate partner. So and it's something that can be completed by a victim, a service provider, or a friend. So if you are worried about a teen experiencing stalking, whether it's intimate partner or not, I highly recommend going through this assessment with them. It's short. It only takes like 10 or 15 minutes, and it creates a risk profile, and it creates some safety planning suggestions. And so really highly recommend that tool. I want to kind of close by just making a call here for coordination, that these stalking cases are urgent, but our system's not really set up for them. Our system tends to be very incident-based. Something happens, we respond to that one incident, and it simply doesn't apply here when stalking is a pattern of behavior that often lasts years, crosses jurisdictions, and can involve a variety of behaviors, some legal on their own, some criminal on their own. And I know it's really easy to pay lip service to coordination, and it's much harder to do in practice, and I totally understand that. But it's so, so critical, because so often in stalking cases, what happens is that the police over here know something, the police across the county line know something else, maybe your guidance counselor knows something, and the victim service provider knows something, and no one is connecting the dots. And so these cases get lost, and people fail to see the urgency. We need people at all levels taking this seriously, right? We need our awareness and prevention educators in our health classes, wherever we're talking, hopefully, about dating violence and consent, to also talk about stalking, healthy relationships, setting boundaries, and help people identify stalking and take it seriously so that when it happens, they report it. We need then our schools to respond with some urgency. We need our law enforcement officers to charge it. We need our prosecutors to argue that charge and take it up. We need our judges to sentence it appropriately. We need our victim service providers keeping victims safe, recognizing stalking behaviors and connecting them to the right resources. And we need our judges to sentence it appropriately. Then we need our corrections and probations folks to continue to hold those offenders accountable and recognize their high likelihood for recidivism. When any of that doesn't happen, we lose stalking victims. And every week I read cases about victims who are killed or badly hurt after what's often a very long course of conduct of stalking that was dismissed because, it was just gifts, it was just text messages. And unfortunately, there's no one who's in charge of making these connections and making this happen. So it kind of has to be you, in whatever role that you play, making sure that stalking is part of your coordinated community response, and that you're really, of course, with victim privacy in mind, sharing that information and making sure that we recognize the urgency of these cases. So I know I'm just about out of time here. I'm just going to highlight a few resources for further learning. And then I'm happy to stick around if folks have questions, but I want to respect your time, and I know I'm just about out of it. So SPARC is a project of Equitas. They are the prosecutor's resource for violence against women. And so if you're working with a prosecutor on stalking or any related crimes, they're a really wonderful resource, free 24/7 technical assistance. IACP, working with law enforcement, they have things like a directory of cybercrime labs. All social networks like Facebook, Snapchat, they all have a portal that law enforcement can reach out to get information. Those are all located here. And so just a really good resource for any law enforcement you're working with. And an EDD's tech safety app. Of course, a lot of stalking happens through the use of technology. This is a really great starting point for learning more about cell phone safety. You know, what can be tampered with? How do I check for that? How do I protect around that? So it's a free app, so I really recommend it. NCJFCJ has this how to gather technology abuse evidence for court. Even if you're not a self-represented litigant, it goes over some really great evidence collection strategies for digital evidence. So a lot of times we see technology as the enemy. We're like, no, there's so much stalking with technology, but actually it can be protective, and it often creates an evidence trail where we may have not had one before when something was an in-person conversation. So that can actually be quite helpful. There's no national stalking hotline. The closest thing we have is Victim Connect, run out of the National Center for Victims of Crime. So if you're not sure where to refer stalking victims, make sure you refer them to Victim Connect. If you're ever sharing a hotline list, like you're sharing RAIN, you're sharing the DV hotline, make sure you share Victim Connect as well. Please don't send victims to us here at SPARC because we don't do direct service, and we end up just having to send them back to Victim Connect. We have stalkingawareness.org, of course, is our website. You know it, you love it. We have all the things I mentioned earlier. We're also on social media and follow us legally, and we do have a newsletter. So again, I just want to thank you so much for your attention to this. Here's some of the things that we offer. This is my contact information. I hope that this is the first time, if it is the first time, that you're hearing from me and not the last. We need to continue the conversation and learn more about stalking. And SPARC is a relatively new agency. We're just funded in 2017. We're working to get up to speed and to get you everything that you need. So we provide training, technical assistance, resources. We want to hear from you about what would help you do your work better. I also just want to say, I know it's easy for me to sit here, you know, and say, do this, do that, do this, but really you're the ones on the ground keeping victims safe and holding offenders accountable. It's all easier said than done, and I so recognize that and appreciate you so deeply for the work that you're doing, for your attention to this issue, and for everything that you do to keep victims safe and hold offenders accountable. So thank you so much. Feel free to reach out for further training or resources. It was a pleasure having you on. I know that closed captioning is going to stop, but I will keep the if we can keep the room open for just a few minutes, if folks have questions, I'm happy to answer those. And if you have any we didn't get to, then feel free to email me. Let's see. So I'm just going to go. Are there any questions folks have they would like to voice at this time? I wasn't able to flag them during Okay, I might have missed some questions earlier, so I'm sorry if I didn't see it. In terms of certificate, yes, we can send a certificate. Okay, I have a question. What's your read on how judges rule on the fear requirement? The fear requirement varies so much statute to statute, so I'd have to look at your specific state statute, and that's a good question for our Equitas colleagues as well, because that's their whole specialty. I think the problem is in some statutes, the fear is quite narrow. So what we like to see is like on the Clery Act, very broad. It says stalking is a pattern of behavior that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear or emotional distress. Super broad. We love it. For other states, for example, in Virginia, because I just did a bunch of trainings there, it's would cause a person to fear, and then fear of what? Where it actually is quite specific. Fear for their physical, and I'm paraphrasing, this isn't the exact language, but it's fear of bodily harm to themselves or someone in their household. So that's actually really narrow, right? What if you're afraid of being followed forever, but you don't think the person will hurt you? Does that qualify under the stalking statute? So it really depends what your statute says, and then of course there are better or worse ways to argue it. So I think that sometimes judges, because there's very little training on stalking for everyone in our field, including judges, sometimes they fail to see the contextual nature of stalking.
Hi everyone, this is Daniel with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. We will send your questions from the chat box to Dana, and they will reach out to you with responses. So with that, everyone have a great day, and we will be ending the webinar now. Thank you for attending. Bye.